Kings feared them, not because they commanded vast armies, not because they rolled siege engines across the plains, not because they could shatter walls with fire or flood a battlefield with cavalry. They were feared because they did not need to arrive as an army. A ruler could surround himself with guards, armor, loyal servants, locked gates, and prayers whispered before sleep. And still, somewhere close by, there might already be a man waiting, patient, unknown, unnoticed. That was the terror of the Hashashin. They turned secrecy into a weapon and made powerful men doubt the safety of their own rooms. But to understand why this small mountain-based order unsettled empires, we have to move slowly. Past the legend, past the exaggerated tales repeated by frightened enemies and fascinated outsiders, past the image of faceless killers slipping through the dark. Because the real story is stranger than the myth in a quieter way. It begins in a world of competing faiths, fractured loyalties, and rulers who believed power could be measured in soldiers, fortresses, and gold. Then came a movement that understood something different. Fear did not always need numbers. Sometimes it only needed certainty. The certainty that no enemy was entirely beyond reach. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The Hashashin were not ghosts, though their enemies often wrote about them as if they were. They were not demons, nor the simple villains of Crusader rumor. They were human beings shaped by conviction, pressure, danger, and a hostile political world. Their violence was real, their reputation was carefully sharpened, and their greatest achievement may not have been the dagger itself, but the idea that the dagger planted in the imagination. For a king, that idea could be more frightening than an army at the gates. To reach Alamut, you first have to understand what kind of place it was. Not merely a castle, not simply a military stronghold placed on a convenient hill. Alamut was a statement built into the mountains of northern Iran, high in the Alborz range, where the land itself seemed to argue against invasion. Steep slopes, narrow approaches, valleys that could swallow an army's confidence before the first arrow was fired. A fortress like that did not just protect bodies, it protected an idea. And for the Nizari Ismailis, that mattered. Their power was never going to come from controlling open plains or marching great columns of infantry beneath banners. They were too few for that, too surrounded, too politically isolated. They needed something different. A place that could not easily be rushed, a refuge that bought time, and a symbol that made their enemies imagine a hidden command center watching from above the clouds. Alamut became all of this. Its name is often translated, perhaps a little too neatly, as Eagle's Nest or something close to it. Whether that phrase captures the exact linguistic history is less important than what it reveals about the way people came to picture the place. Alamut belonged to the vertical world. It was not a city that invited trade and noise. It was not a palace meant to impress visiting diplomats with gardens, fountains, and polished reception halls. It was a height, a lookout, a clenched fist of stone and discipline. From below, the fortress would have seemed remote, almost to the point of arrogance. But remoteness was not weakness. In the politics of the 11th century, distance could be armor. A ruler on a plain had to defend roads, markets, palaces, and vulnerable towns. A mountain fortress asked a different question. How much blood, time, money, and patience was an enemy willing to spend just to reach the gate? That question shaped the history of Alamut. A fortress is never only walls. It is also food storage, water, paths known by locals, loyalties in nearby villages, messengers who understand the terrain, and defenders who know that every hour gained may matter more than every sword drawn. Alamut's importance lay in this combination. It was physical protection, yes, but also psychological leverage. It allowed a relatively small community to behave as if it had more weight than numbers alone would justify. This is one of the details people often miss when they talk about the Hashashin. The legend likes to focus on the single assassin moving through a crowd, the dagger, the sudden attack, the impossible escape, or the lack of one. But none of that could have existed for long without a system behind it. Alamut was the center of that system. It gave the movement a home, a command structure, a place to train loyalty and preserve memory, and a difficult target for enemies who preferred problems they could solve with a campaign season. The fortress also changed the imagination of those who feared it. A king surrounded by guards could picture an army. He could count tents on the horizon. He could estimate cavalry. He could send scouts, buy allies, fortify gates. But Alamut was harder to measure. It stood far away, yet its influence appeared in places that were not far away at all. In courts, in cities, in whispered warnings, in the careful behavior of men who suspected that someone near them might not be what he seemed. That was the strange genius of the place. Its strength was both isolation and reach. For those inside, Alamut offered survival. For those outside, it became a rumor with walls. And rumors, when attached to a real fortress, can become politically useful. The more inaccessible Alamut seemed, the more it encouraged exaggeration. The more disciplined its followers appeared, the more enemies filled the gaps with fantasy. A remote mountain stronghold naturally invites stories because few outsiders can check them. When people cannot see clearly, they imagine intensely. Sometimes they imagine gardens of paradise, sometimes drugged initiates, sometimes a master who can command death with a gesture. But before those legends hardened, there was a more practical reality. Alamut worked because it fit the needs of a besieged movement. It allowed the Nizari Ismailis to survive in fragments rather than as a conventional state with a single exposed capital. It helped connect other fortified positions. It gave missionaries and agents a point of orientation. It made the community harder to erase, because destroying an idea hidden in mountain networks is not the same as defeating an army on a field. Still, we should be careful not to romanticize it. A fortress in the mountains could be cold, confined, and dependent on constant vigilance. It was not freedom in the easy sense. It was survival under pressure. The people who lived there were not floating above history. They were trapped inside its sharpest edges. Their security came with isolation. Their discipline came with danger. Their confidence came from knowing that the world below was often hostile. In that way, Alamut was less like a throne and more like a lantern kept alive in bad weather. It did not make the Hashashin invincible. No fortress does, but it gave them the one thing a hunted movement needs most: continuity. As long as Alamut held, enemies had to treat the Nizari Ismailis not as a scattered sect to be dismissed, but as a political force with a mind, a memory, and a mountain from which orders might descend. And from that height, Hassan-i Sabbah would begin shaping a form of power that looked almost upside down to the rulers around him. They had armies, titles, courts, and tribute. He had a fortress that was difficult to reach, followers who were difficult to frighten, and a method that would make distance feel meaningless. Before Hassan-i Sabbah became a name surrounded by fear, rumor, and later invention, he was something less theatrical and far more dangerous. He was a thinker with patience. That may sound quieter than the image history has attached to him. No hidden garden, no hypnotized killers bowing before a mountain master, no theatrical villain sitting in a fortress, sending men to die with a wave of his hand. Those images belong mostly to later storytelling, shaped by enemies, travelers, and the natural human appetite for making secretive movements look stranger than they were. The man himself is harder to see clearly. We know Hassan-i Sabbah emerged from the intellectual and religious world of the medieval Islamic East, a world where theology was never merely private belief. Religious allegiance could decide patronage, safety, law, legitimacy, and political destiny. Ideas moved through teachers, missionaries, courts, debates, and networks of loyalty. To believe differently was not always a matter of personal conscience. Sometimes it was a political act with consequences. Hassan learned to move in that world. He was not born as a mountain warlord. He became a strategist through study, persuasion, and pressure. His early life is wrapped in accounts that vary in detail, and the more dramatic versions should be handled carefully. But what stands out across the tradition is not brute force. It is intelligence. He appears as a man trained in argument, doctrine, organization, and timing. A man who understood that influence could be built before anyone noticed it had become power. That was essential. The movement he would come to lead, the Nizari Ismaili cause, existed inside a wider Islamic landscape marked by rivalry and fragmentation. Sunni political authority dominated much of the region, especially through the Seljuk Empire. Ismaili communities had to survive in places where hostility could be official, social, and sometimes violent. A person like Hassan could not simply announce a revolution and expect followers to appear. He had to cultivate trust in small circles. He had to know when to speak and when to remain invisible. He had to read not only books, but rooms. This is where his genius becomes clearer. Many rulers mistake secrecy for weakness. They assume that what is not public is not powerful. Hassan seems to have understood the opposite. A quiet network can grow beneath the surface of a political order precisely because the powerful are busy watching other powerful people. Courts watch courts. Armies watch armies. Viziers watch rivals. Meanwhile, a missionary with discipline can enter towns, build relationships, teach doctrine, identify sympathizers, and leave behind a structure that does not look like a threat until it has already become one. His patience was not passive, it was a method. And that method tells us something important about the later Hashashin. Their story did not begin with murder. It began with organization. Before the dagger became the symbol remembered by enemies, there was preaching, recruitment, coded loyalty, local knowledge, and the slow mapping of political vulnerability. Hassan's real weapon, at least at first, was not the willingness to kill. It was the ability to make people choose a side in private before history forced them to do it in public. The religious dimension matters here, because without it the story becomes too shallow. Modern audiences often hear about the assassins and imagine a mercenary cult, a secret guild of killers hired to remove inconvenient men. That misses the core of what made them durable. The Nizari Ismailis were not simply a band of professional murderers. They were a religious political community, convinced that leadership, truth and authority had been misunderstood or seized by the wrong powers. Hassan's commitment gave his strategy depth. It turned survival into duty, obedience into meaning, and danger into a test of conviction. That does not make the violence harmless. It makes it more historically intelligible. People will risk far more for a sacred cause than for a paycheck. They will endure isolation, hardship, and fear if those things fit inside a larger story about justice, loyalty, and salvation. Hassan-i Sabbah appears to have understood this with unusual clarity. He did not need to command the largest force. He needed a disciplined minority that believed its obedience mattered beyond ordinary politics. But belief alone would not have been enough. A visionary without strategy becomes a martyr or a footnote. A strategist without belief becomes a schemer for hire. Hassan's significance lies in the combination. He could think in religious terms and political terms at the same time. He could imagine a community of the faithful and also understand supply lines, fortresses, alliances, enemies, propaganda, and fear. That combination made him difficult for conventional rulers to categorize. Was he a preacher? A rebel? A commander? A heretic in the eyes of his enemies? A state builder? A threat hiding behind doctrine? The answer, inconveniently, is yes to several of these at once. This is why the legend later became so useful. Legends simplify. They take a man whose real power came from patience, conviction, and institutional design and reduce him to a sinister old master of assassins. That version is easier to condemn, easier to repeat, and frankly, easier to sell. But it hides the more unsettling possibility that Hassan was effective not because he was monstrous in some supernatural way, but because he was disciplined, intelligent, and very good at understanding the weaknesses of stronger men. He knew empires often look solid from the outside while being full of anxious individuals within. A ruler may possess thousands of soldiers, but he still sleeps in one room. A minister may sign orders that affect entire provinces, but he still walks through a courtyard, attends prayers, receives petitions, and trusts someone to bring him food. Power creates distance from ordinary people, yet it also creates routines. Hassan's later movement would become terrifying because it studied those routines. But that habit of study began before Alamut, in the years when he was learning how influence travels. He did not conquer by charging first. He prepared, and preparation is rarely dramatic while it is happening. It looks like conversations, travel, teaching, waiting, choosing the right people, letting opponents underestimate what they cannot easily see. Then, at the right moment, the hidden work becomes visible all at once. For Hassan-i Sabbah, that moment would come at Alamut, not with a great army smashing against the walls, not with a siege that announced itself to every ruler in the region, but with something much more revealing of the man himself. A conquest that looked less like an attack than an infection of loyalty, spreading quietly until the fortress had already changed hands in spirit before it changed hands in name. The capture of Alamut in 1090 does not sound, at first, like the beginning of a legend. There is no thunderous assault to describe, no great breach in the wall, no heroic ladder raised under arrows, no battlefield where thousands fell and chroniclers could later arrange the dead into a lesson about destiny. Compared with the usual theater of medieval conquest, the taking of Alamut is almost unsettling in its restraint. That restraint is precisely why it matters. According to the broad shape preserved in later accounts, Hassan-i Sabbah did not seize Alamut by smashing his way into it. He gained it by entering the human structure of the fortress before openly possessing the stone one. Supporters were cultivated, loyalties shifted. Influence moved quietly through the people who mattered. By the time the fortress changed hands, the decisive victory had already happened somewhere less visible, in belief, persuasion, and allegiance. This was not a siege in the ordinary sense. It was a conversion of the inside, and that detail reveals more about Hassan than any battlefield triumph could have done. A conventional commander looks at a fortress and asks how many men are needed to surround it. Hassan seems to have asked a different question. Who inside already doubts? Who can be persuaded? Who can be trusted? And how long can change remain invisible? It is a colder kind of strategy, but also a more economical one. A siege consumes food, money, animals, men, time, and political attention. It announces danger. It invites relief forces. It gives enemies a chance to gather. Infiltration, if it succeeds, does almost the opposite. It keeps the surface calm while the foundations are being rearranged. The mountain did not fall because the mountain was weak. It fell because the people within its world were reachable. That is the first unmistakable sign of the method that would later make the Hashashin so feared. They did not begin by asking whether an enemy was physically protected. They asked whether protection itself could be bypassed. They studied the difference between walls and loyalty, between gates and access, between possession and control. A fortress might belong to one ruler on paper, yet already belonged to another in the minds of those who opened doors, carried messages, watched storehouses, or listened to sermons. Alamut's capture was not merely a local success. It was a demonstration. It showed that Hassan-i Sabbah could win without playing by the rules preferred by stronger powers. The Seljuks and their allies could field armies. They could command cities. They could issue decrees backed by public authority. Hassan could not match them on that scale, and he did not try. Instead, he proved that a small, disciplined movement could take the one thing it most needed by moving beneath the level of official sight. This is where the story becomes easy to misunderstand. Modern retellings often treat the assassins as if their history begins with spectacular violence, as though their entire identity emerged fully formed from the act of killing. But the capture of Alamut suggests almost the opposite. Their founding victory was an act of patience. Its lesson was not that bloodshed solves every problem. Its lesson was that power often changes hands before anyone admits it has changed hands. There is something deeply unnerving about that. A battle at least gives rulers a clear enemy. You can see banners. You can hear drums. You can prepare your own men to stand somewhere and resist. But what do you do against a movement that enters through conversation? What do you do against a rival who can wait, persuade, disappear, and return as a fact already accomplished? For Alamut's previous holder, the realization may have come too late. The exact emotional texture of that moment is lost to us, and we should not pretend to know every exchange. But historically, the transfer of Alamut stands as a rare kind of conquest, one that makes the fortress seem less captured than quietly replaced from within. And after 1090, Alamut was no longer just a remote mountain stronghold. It became the center of a new political reality. From there, Hassan-i Sabbah could turn defense into endurance and endurance into influence. The fortress gave his followers a secure base. but the manner of its capture gave them something equally valuable: a template. In a hostile world, survival would depend on seeing openings that larger powers ignored. It would depend on people placed carefully, loyalties built patiently, and fear used with precision rather than waste. The symbolic value of the event was immense. If Alamut could be taken without a conventional siege, then perhaps other forms of security were also more fragile than they appeared. If a fortress could be won through hidden allegiance, then a court might be penetrated, a minister approached, a ruler unsettled, a rival made to wonder whether the danger was outside the walls or already among the trusted. That thought would travel farther than any army Hassan possessed. It also helps explain why Alamut became so difficult for enemies to think about clearly. It was not just a place they wanted to conquer. It was proof of a method they feared. Every stone of the fortress seemed to remind them that Hassan's strength did not lie in meeting power head-on. His strength lay in making power uncertain of itself. Still, we should resist the temptation to make this sound effortless. Quiet victories are often remembered as clean because the disorder has been hidden from the record. In reality, gaining Alamut would have required risk, negotiation, secrecy, and the constant possibility of discovery. A single betrayal could have ruined the effort. A suspicious commander could have closed the gates. A frightened supporter could have recanted. Patience is not the same as safety. What Hassan achieved was not magic. It was organization under pressure. That, more impressive than magic, because it belongs to the real world. After the capture, Hassan is said to have remained at Alamut for the rest of his life, directing the movement from that elevated refuge. Later imagination would turn him into the old man of the mountain, a phrase loaded with crusader fascination and distortion. But in 1090, before the legend hardened, the image is simpler and sharper. A man who had found the right fortress at the right moment, by using the right kind of invisible force. He had not yet built the terrifying reputation that would echo across courts and crusader camps. But the principle was already there. Do not attack the wall first. Enter the world behind it. Alamut may have stood high above the valleys, but it was never outside the world. That is an important distinction. Mountain fortresses can make a community harder to reach, but they cannot make it invisible to politics. They cannot make grain appear from stone. They cannot erase rival claims to authority. They cannot stop empires from noticing that a new power has taken root in a place where it was not invited. After Hassan-i Sabbah secured Alamut, the Nizari Ismailis found themselves in a position that was both strong and precarious. They had a defensible center. They had discipline. They had a cause. But around them stretched a political landscape crowded with enemies, suspicious neighbors, and rulers who had every reason to see them as a threat. The Seljuk Empire dominated much of the region, and for the Seljuk political order, the Nizari presence was not just an inconvenience. It challenged the religious and political legitimacy on which that order depended. In a world where authority was often justified through faith, law, lineage, and public recognition, a rival religious movement could not be treated as a harmless private belief. It implied another center of loyalty, another interpretation of rightful leadership, another answer to the question of who should be obeyed. That made the Nizaris dangerous even when they were not attacking anyone. This is one of the hardest things for a modern viewer to feel instinctively. We are used to imagining religion and politics as separate categories, even when they overlap. In Hassan's world, they were deeply entangled. A sermon could be political. A conversion could be strategic. A dispute about rightful guidance could become a question of taxation, military loyalty, and rebellion. The Nizari Ismailis were not simply disagreeing in private. Their existence suggested that the public order around them was built on contested ground. For the Seljuks and their Sunni allies, that was intolerable. But the Seljuks were not the only concern. Rival Muslim factions competed for influence. Local rulers guarded their own interests. Cities and valleys had shifting loyalties. Beyond the eastern Mediterranean, Crusader states were taking shape in the aftermath of the First Crusade, introducing yet another layer of violence and diplomacy into the region. The Nizaris did not live in a simple map of two sides. They lived in a broken chessboard, where today's enemy might be tomorrow's temporary contact, and yesterday's rival might suddenly become useful because someone more dangerous had appeared. Survival in that world required more than courage. It required flexibility without losing identity. That is a difficult balance for any besieged movement. Bend too much, and you dissolve into the politics around you. Refuse to bend at all, and you may be crushed by the first enemy patient enough to starve you out. The Nizari Ismailis had to learn how to remain themselves while negotiating with a world that wanted them contained, converted, expelled, or destroyed. Open warfare alone could never solve that problem. A small mountain-based community can win local clashes. It can hold difficult castles. It can ambush, delay, and endure. But it cannot casually defeat every army that a major empire can send. It cannot replace the manpower, wealth, and administrative reach of larger powers. If Hassan had tried to behave like a conventional king, he would likely have been destroyed like a minor rebel who overestimated his moment. So the Nizaris developed a different logic of power. They made themselves costly to attack. They made themselves difficult to predict. They built or acquired fortified positions where geography multiplied their strength. They used networks of communication and belief to connect people who might otherwise have been isolated. And when necessary, they used targeted violence not as random cruelty, but as a way to influence the calculations of enemies too large to defeat directly. This is not a moral defense. It is a strategic explanation. The assassins became infamous because they killed particular people in particular ways. But the conditions that produced that tactic were not theatrical. They were practical and brutal. If your enemies can send armies and you cannot, you search for pressure points. If a state depends on commanders, ministers, judges, governors, and public confidence, then those become the vulnerable joints. A dagger in such a world was not merely a weapon of murder. It was a message delivered into the nervous system of power. Still, the Nizari position remained dangerous. Every success made them more feared, and every act of intimidation invited retaliation. Their reputation protected them, but it also marked them. The more rulers believed Alamut could reach into their courts, the more urgently they wanted Alamut eliminated. Fear is useful, but it is not stable. It buys time. It rarely buys peace. That tension shaped the movement for generations. Inside their fortresses, the Nizaris had to cultivate discipline because disorder would have been fatal. A divided army can lose a battle. A divided hidden network can expose everyone. Trust had to be guarded. Messages had to move carefully. Agents had to know enough to act, but perhaps not enough to endanger the whole system if captured. Leaders had to decide when to threaten, when to negotiate, when to strike, and when restraint was more valuable than action. The surrounding world forced them to become political adults very quickly. That is why reducing the Hashashin to a mere cult of killers misses the central drama. Their story is not simply about men with daggers. It is about a vulnerable community trying to survive among powers that outnumbered it, condemned it, and often misunderstood it. Their methods were harsh because their environment was harsh. Their secrecy was not decoration. It was infrastructure. And their enemies, for all their contempt, understood the problem. A conventional rebel might be defeated in battle. A rebellious city could be besieged. A warlord could be bribed or replaced. But Alamut represented something more stubborn. A state that did not look fully like a state. An army that did not behave fully like an army. And a faith community whose loyalty could not easily be measured by territory alone. That made it hard to crush and harder to ignore. From this hostile ring of empires, factions, crusaders, and local powers, the Hashashin's most famous form would emerge. Not a massed formation under sunlight, but a network. Not soldiers waiting for a battle line, but messengers, missionaries, informants, and devoted agents moving through the seams of the medieval world. The enemies around Alamut believed they had cornered a small mountain order. In reality, they had helped teach it how to become something no ordinary army could quite defend against. An ordinary army announces itself. It gathers where people can see it. It needs roads, camps, animals, supply lines, armorers, cooks, paymasters, and banners to tell everyone who is approaching. Even before it fights, it makes noise in the world. Villages hear of it. Scouts report it. Markets feel it. A marching army has weight, but that weight leaves tracks. The Hashashin learned to become lighter than that. Their strength did not depend on massed soldiers moving together across open ground. It depended on connection. A message passed through careful hands, a preacher welcomed into a town, a sympathizer who knew which official was hated and which gatekeeper could be trusted, a fortified outpost placed where it could watch a valley, shelter a traveler, or preserve a community if the nearest city became unsafe. This was an army made less of formations than relationships. That difference matters because it explains why the Nizari Ismailis could survive where a conventional rebellion might have failed. A traditional army can be impressive and fragile at the same time. Defeat it in the field, and its strength may collapse in a single day. Cut its supplies, and courage begins to starve. Kill its commander, and confusion spreads through ranks built to obey visible orders. A network dies differently. It can lose a messenger and still have another path. It can lose one fortress and still preserve another. It can retreat from public view without disappearing. It can place loyalty inside places where soldiers cannot be stationed. Households, markets, religious circles, courtly service, and the private anxieties of powerful men. That made the Nizari movement difficult to measure. Enemies could count castles more easily than convictions. The outer layer of this system was built through missionaries and local supporters. These were not merely religious teachers in the abstract. In a world where doctrine, law, and political allegiance were bound together, a missionary could be a recruiter, a diplomat, an organizer, and an intelligence gatherer all at once. He listened as much as he preached. He learned who resented the governor, who feared the Seljuks, who had family ties in another town, who might shelter a traveler, and who was too talkative to be trusted with anything important. This kind of work is rarely dramatic in the records, but it is the kind of work that makes dramatic events possible. Behind the famous image of the assassin stood many people who never touched a dagger. They carried letters, watched roads, preserved contacts, maintained supplies, passed warnings from one stronghold to another. Their labor was not glamorous, which may be why legend forgot it. But secrecy depends on ordinary tasks performed with extraordinary care. A hidden movement cannot survive on fanaticism alone. It needs administration. That word may feel too dull for the story, but it belongs here. Administration is what turns devotion into endurance. Without it, loyalty burns bright and then burns out. With it, a persecuted community can hold ground, communicate across distance, and decide when action is worth the risk. Alamut was the heart, but the movement needed veins, fortified outposts, trusted routes, coded habits of communication, and disciplined local cells allowed Hassan-i Sabbah's followers to act beyond the walls of the mountain fortress. And then there was the inner circle, remembered most vividly by enemies, the Fidai. The word is often translated in the sense of one who sacrifices himself, and that is how later memory would frame them. These were the agents prepared to carry out missions at close range, sometimes in public, often with little realistic chance of escape. They became the living edge of the movement's reputation. Yet even here, the most important thing was not wildness. It was restraint. A reckless killer is useful once, perhaps. A disciplined agent can alter politics. The Fidai had to wait, to observe, to approach, to choose a place where the act would be seen by the right people and understood by the right audience. He had to accept that the mission might demand his death, but also that his death was not the point. The point was the message carried by the act. If violence was used, it had to travel farther than the blade. That is why calling the Hashashin simply assassins can shrink the story while seeming to explain it. The word points to their most notorious tactic, but not to the structure that made the tactic meaningful. A dagger in a crowd could be a crime. A dagger delivered by an organized movement against a chosen figure at a symbolic moment became political communication. Their enemies understood this, even when they described it with horror. A ruler could defeat soldiers and still fear servants. He could strengthen a gate and still distrust the man who opened it. He could punish a village and still wonder whether the punishment had created 3 new sympathizers in the next valley. The Nizari network turned the ordinary life of politics into a field of uncertainty. The court, the mosque, the market, the road, the private audience chamber, all became spaces where influence might already be present. This was not invisibility in the magical sense. It was social invisibility. The agents of a network do not need to vanish into smoke. They need only look like they belong where they are. A messenger looks like a messenger, a servant like a servant, a religious student like a religious student. The genius of such a system is that it hides inside categories people already expect to see. Suspicion then becomes exhausting because it cannot settle on one obvious threat, and exhaustion has political value. A frightened ruler makes different decisions. He delays. He overprotects himself. He mistrusts advisors. He spends money on guards and informants. He may avoid certain journeys, change routines, or negotiate where he would once have threatened. Even when no attack occurs, the possibility of one begins to govern behavior. In that sense, the Hashashin's network could succeed without constant violence. Fear did some of the traveling for them. But the same structure that made them powerful also made them vulnerable in a different way. Networks depend on trust, and trust can be broken. a captured messenger, a defecting supporter, a careless conversation, a forged letter, a local feud. Any of these could expose more than one life. The Nizaris had to live with the danger that their own strength, their hidden connectedness, could become a chain leading enemies from one person to the next. Their discipline was not ornamental, it was survival. This is the birth of their different kind of army, not a replacement for fortresses, but an extension of them. Alamut gave the movement height and endurance. The network gave it reach. The Fida'i gave it a point of terrifying focus. Together, they created a form of power that larger states struggled to answer because it refused to stand still long enough to be crushed in the usual way. There is a reason their legend became so sharp. People remember the blade because the blade is easy to picture. But the more unsettling truth is that the blade was only the final visible inch of a much longer instrument. Behind it were years of teaching, listening, recruiting, mapping, waiting, and surviving. The army was not hidden because it lacked courage. It was hidden because hiddenness was the battlefield. The dagger is the part everyone remembers. It is small enough to hide, intimate enough to terrify, and dramatic enough to survive in the imagination for centuries. A sword belongs to battle. A spear belongs to a line of men. A bow can kill from distance, with a kind of cold separation between the archer and the body that falls. But a dagger requires nearness. That was why it became such a powerful symbol in stories about the Hashashin. It implied that the impossible distance between ruler and enemy had somehow vanished. The guarded man had been reached. The layers around him had failed. The palace, the escort, the ceremony, the armor, the bodyguards, all of it had been reduced to decoration at the critical moment. Yet the dagger itself was never the real weapon. The real weapon was the thought it left behind. No ruler can defend only against what has already happened. He must defend against what might happen next. And this is where the Hashashin's power became psychological rather than merely physical. A single successful killing did not just remove a person from the political board. It taught everyone watching that protection was conditional, that routines were dangerous, and that the boundary between public authority and private vulnerability was thinner than they wanted to believe. A ruler could replace a murdered minister. He could appoint another governor. He could punish suspects, execute guards, interrogate servants, issue decrees, and surround himself with more men. But the deeper damage was harder to repair. The attack had introduced uncertainty into the system. It made the powerful ask a question that armies almost never forced them to ask. Who close to me is already lost? That question is poison to a court. Courts depend on trust, even when everyone inside them pretends not to trust anyone. A ruler needs men who carry messages, serve food, open doors, prepare horses, copy letters, guard chambers, receive petitioners, arrange meetings, and stand nearby during rituals of power. No king, sultan, lord, or commander can personally inspect every loyalty every hour. Authority requires delegation. Delegation requires proximity. Proximity creates vulnerability. The Hashashin understood this with rare clarity. Their violence worked not because it was constant, but because it was selective. If attacks had been random, they would have become noise. Horrifying, yes, but politically confused. The terror of the Hashashin came from the sense that their targets were chosen, their timing considered, and their access somehow prepared long before the moment of action. Even when enemies exaggerated their reach, the exaggeration fed the very effect the Nizaris benefited from. Fear does not need perfect accuracy to change behavior. This is one of the uncomfortable lessons of their history. A reputation can become operational. Once enough people believe a group can reach any palace, every unexplained servant, every unfamiliar face, every delayed letter begins to carry a second meaning. The actual network may be smaller than imagined. The actual plan may be less elaborate than rumor claims. But suspicion magnifies the threat, and suspicion is cheap compared with armies. In that sense, the Hashashin's enemies helped arm them. Every frightened account, every dramatic retelling, every rumor of impossible obedience or hidden gardens made Alamut seem more uncanny. The more monstrous the order appeared in hostile imagination, the more its name could travel ahead of its agents. This does not mean the Nizari leadership controlled every story told about them. They did not, but they operated in a world where reputation mattered, and they were not naive about the uses of fear. The message was simple enough to cross languages and borders. No palace is sealed. No guard is enough. No enemy is entirely unreachable. That message explains why the dagger became larger than itself. It was not just a tool of killing, it was a signature, a public reminder that the strong were still made of flesh, that the distance between command and mortality could collapse in a breath. For men who lived by visible dominance, this was humiliating. Medieval rulers were expected to project certainty. They rode with escorts, sat above petitioners, appeared in ceremonial spaces, and used architecture to turn hierarchy into something you could physically feel. The Hashashin punctured that performance. They made power look nervous, and nervous power behaves differently. It may negotiate when it would rather punish. It may redirect armies. It may spend resources guarding individuals instead of expanding territory. It may hesitate before persecuting a community known for patient retaliation. The Hashashin could not conquer empires in the usual way, but they could interfere with the confidence that empires require. That interference was the true violence, not because death was unimportant. Death was final, and for the victims, it was everything. But politically, the death of one man often mattered less than the transformation of all the men who remained alive. Those survivors carried the lesson forward. They altered routines. They whispered. They looked twice at familiar faces. They imagined Alamut not as a distant fortress, but as a possibility inside their own walls. This is why the Order's methods were so disturbing to conventional military culture. A battlefield has a certain terrible honesty. Two forces meet. The outcome may be brutal, but the danger is declared. The Hashashin operated in the spaces where danger was not supposed to be. At prayer, in a procession, near a court. During moments when authority was performing its own security. Their attacks suggested that the world of ceremony and the world of violence were not separate after all. There is a reason that felt like an insult as well as a threat. For rulers, being unreachable was part of being powerful. The Hashashin challenged that assumption directly. They did not need to defeat all the soldiers between themselves and a ruler. They needed to prove that under the right conditions, those soldiers might not matter. Once that proof existed, even rarely, the entire architecture of protection looked less absolute. But we should also be careful not to turn this into fantasy. They could not reach anyone, anywhere, at will. No organization can. Some targets were too well protected. Some missions failed. Some stories grew in the telling. Later legends often inflated their discipline into mind control and their secrecy into something almost supernatural. The more grounded truth is less magical and more unsettling. They were effective because they studied human systems. They noticed that power depends on habits, and habits can be entered. A locked gate is only as secure as the person allowed to open it. That is the kind of fact no ruler enjoys contemplating for long. So the dagger became the image, but not the explanation. The explanation lay in patience, intelligence, reputation, and the deliberate use of symbolic violence. The Hashashin did not simply kill to remove enemies. They killed in ways that made remaining enemies imagine themselves as future targets. That was the difference between an act of murder and an act of political theater. And once that theater had begun, every court became a stage. Every guard became part of the scenery. Every ruler, no matter how armored, had to wonder whether the most dangerous man in the room was not the one shouting threats outside the gate, but the quiet one already standing close enough to bow. A killing done in secret can remove a man. A killing done in public can rearrange the thoughts of everyone who sees it, hears of it, or fears being next. This distinction sits near the center of the Hashashin story. Their most infamous acts were not only physical attacks, they were staged messages delivered through violence, aimed at audiences larger than the victim. The target mattered, of course. A vizier, a commander, a local enemy, a ruler whose policies threatened Nizari survival. These were not random choices. But the meaning of the act depended on who witnessed it, when it happened, and what lesson the surrounding world drew from it. That is why the phrase political theater is useful, though it should not make the violence sound artificial. The deaths were real. The grief was real. The fear was real. But the assassins understood, or at least practiced with remarkable consistency, that power is partly a performance. Medieval rulers did not simply govern, they appeared. They processed through streets. They attended prayer. They received petitioners. They sat in courtly spaces designed to show hierarchy. Their authority was made visible again and again so that everyone watching could feel the order of the world. To strike in such a setting was to interrupt the performance. It was not merely saying, "This man can be killed." It was saying, "The world arranged around this man cannot protect him." That message could travel farther than a military victory because it did not require an army to be believed. A single act, if chosen carefully, could pass from eyewitnesses to courtiers, from courtiers to diplomats, from diplomats to rival rulers, becoming sharper with each retelling. And retelling was part of the weapon. In a society without instant communication, rumor was not a weakness in the system. It was the system. News moved by travelers, merchants, letters, preachers, envoys, and frightened servants who remembered some details and improved others. An assassination could become a story before it became a verified fact. The Hashashin benefited from that unstable space between report and proof. Even when later accounts exaggerated, the exaggeration itself reveals the psychological atmosphere these acts created. The event did not need to remain exactly true to remain politically effective. That is one of the uncomfortable realities of fear. It travels well without documents. It does not wait for archives. It does not require every witness to agree. Once a ruler heard that a powerful man had been struck in a supposedly secure place. He did not need perfect evidence before changing his behavior. Caution rarely waits for certainty. The public nature of many attacks also complicated retaliation. If a ruler were killed in battle, his supporters could respond militarily in the usual way. If a minister died from illness, succession could proceed. But when a chosen figure was killed at close range, often by someone prepared to die, the response became tangled with humiliation. Who failed? The guards, the household, the intelligence network, the victim himself for trusting the wrong person. A public attack did not only kill upward, it spread blame sideways. Suspicion became part of the aftermath. That was why symbolic timing mattered. A murder in a private alley could be dismissed as a crime or feud. An attack in a public or ceremonial setting made avoidance almost impossible. It forced interpretation. People had to ask what the Nizaris were answering, what they were warning against, what boundary had been crossed, what policy had brought the blade so close. Sometimes the message may have been clear. At other times, later historians must be more cautious. Not every assassination can be neatly decoded. Medieval politics were messy, and chroniclers often wrote from hostile positions, but the pattern remains. The assassins used targeted killing as a language of pressure. This is different from conquest. Conquest tries to occupy territory. Pressure tries to alter decisions. A small movement surrounded by stronger powers could not always compel obedience, but it could raise the cost of aggression. It could warn a governor that persecution might follow him into spaces where soldiers could not help. It could remind a minister that policies written comfortably in a capital might have consequences in the body of the man who signed them. This kind of violence was intimate, and that intimacy was part of the threat. There is a cold political logic here. A commander facing an army may feel fear, but his fear is shared. Thousands stand with him. He belongs to a collective danger. The Hashashin's method isolated the target in imagination before isolating him in fact. It made powerful men feel personally selected, not merely opposed, chosen. That feeling could be more destabilizing than open hostility. And it explains why the assassins did not need to strike constantly. Constant killing would have made them seem chaotic, and perhaps easier to condemn as indiscriminate butchers. Selective killing preserved mystery. It left long stretches of waiting in which enemies did the work of frightening themselves. A ruler who hears nothing for months may not relax. He may grow more alert, wondering whether the silence is absence or preparation. The empty space between attacks became part of the theater. This is where their reputation differs from ordinary brutality. Many medieval powers used violence publicly. Executions, mutilations, displays of defeated enemies, and punitive campaigns were not rare in that age. States knew how to make fear visible. The Hashashin were not unique because they frightened people. They were unique because they frightened the frightening. They turned the methods of intimidation upward. A king could terrorize a village. A sultan could punish a rebellious district. A crusader lord could make an example of prisoners. But the assassins made rulers themselves feel like the exposed body in the public square. That inversion is one reason their story endured. It offered a disturbing counter-image to normal power. Not the great crushing the small, but the small reaching the great through discipline, planning, and sacrifice. Of course, this also made them easy to demonize. When rulers use fear, they often call it justice. When weaker groups use fear, it is more likely to be remembered as treachery. That does not absolve the Hashashin. It does remind us to read the sources with care. Much of what survives about them comes through enemies or outsiders who had reasons to emphasize fanaticism over strategy, madness over politics, and legend over organization. The more spectacular the story became, the less visible the community behind it. And yet, even hostile memory preserves a truth. Their method worked because it made violence legible. A random death creates confusion. A symbolic death creates interpretation. The Hashashin understood that a political act must be read by others to matter. Their victims became unwilling messengers. Their attackers, often doomed from the moment they struck, became proof of devotion. The location became the stage. The timing became the punctuation. The rumor became the echo. This is why the dagger alone cannot explain their power. The dagger killed once. The story killed certainty again and again. And for rulers living inside a world of ceremony, guards, letters, prayers, and hidden resentments, that was the deepest wound. The Hashashin did not have to defeat every enemy in battle. They only had to make each enemy imagine the moment when his own performance of power might be interrupted, publicly and irreversibly, by a man who had been standing close enough to wait. The Fidai have always been the easiest part of this story to sensationalize. They are the figures who step out of the crowd, the men who come close enough to strike, the ones who often do not run afterward, because escape was never guaranteed, and may not even have been expected. In the imagination of their enemies, they became something almost inhuman, perfectly obedient, strangely calm, willing to die at a command, moved by secret promises or unnatural manipulation. But the closer we look, the more careful we have to be. The Fidai were real. Their missions were real. Their willingness to risk death was one of the most frightening elements of Nizari power. Yet many of the stories surrounding them grew through hostile accounts and later legend, tales of drugged initiates, artificial paradises, and men transformed into mindless instruments. Tell us more about medieval fear than about reliable evidence. They explain how outsiders tried to make sense of a kind of loyalty they found disturbing. The real question is not whether these men were enchanted. The real question is what kind of community produces people willing to walk toward death with open eyes. That is a more difficult question and a more human one. The Fidai should not be imagined as disposable madmen thrown into violence for spectacle. Their role required discipline, patience, and nerve. A man carrying out a close-range mission had to live under pressure long before the final moment. He might need to observe a target's movements, wait for a public setting, blend into a place where suspicion could be fatal, and act only when the message would be unmistakable. Recklessness would endanger the mission. Fear would expose him. Vanity might ruin the timing. In that sense, the Fidai was not merely brave. He was trained to disappear into ordinary life until the precise instant when he became impossible to ignore. That transformation is what made him so terrifying. A soldier in armor declares himself. A Fidai might not. He could approach through the human routines of the world. Prayer, petition, service, travel, ceremony, or conversation. He did not need to look monstrous. He needed to look acceptable, perhaps even forgettable. Medieval power depended on the belief that rank created distance, But the Fidai collapsed that distance by becoming part of the scenery. Then, suddenly, he was the event. It is important to remember that these missions were not framed by the Nizaris as isolated acts of personal rage. They belonged to a cause. The Fidai acted within a religious political movement that saw itself as surrounded, threatened, and bound by loyalty to its leadership and community. Whether one condemns the method or studies its logic, that context matters. People do not usually surrender their lives for an abstraction they barely understand. They do it when belief, identity, obedience, and duty have been joined tightly enough that survival is no longer the highest value. This is where later legends both exaggerate and accidentally reveal something true. The stories of blind obedience are almost certainly distorted, but they preserve the shock outsiders felt when confronted with disciplined self-sacrifice. To many enemies, it seemed impossible that a man would knowingly accept death unless he had been drugged, deceived, or promised some theatrical reward. Those explanations made the Fidai easier to dismiss as tools rather than individuals. They also protected the ego of the powerful. It was more comforting to believe an enemy's courage came from trickery than from conviction. Conviction is harder to mock, and yet conviction should not be romanticized either. A person can be sincere and still commit violence. Loyalty can be meaningful and still be used for terrible ends. The Fidai lived at that uncomfortable intersection where devotion becomes politically useful because it overcomes ordinary fear. Their courage was real. So was the suffering caused by their missions. History becomes dishonest when it demands that one cancel out the other. The men themselves remain mostly anonymous to us. That anonymity is part of the tragedy. We know the names of some targets far better than the names of those who struck them. We hear about rulers, viziers, commanders, and lords, men whose offices made their deaths politically visible. But the Fidai often enters the record only as a function: the assassin, the agent, the devotee. His interior life is missing. Did he feel serenity, terror, pride, doubt? Did he rehearse the moment in his mind? Did he believe he would be remembered by God, by his community, by no one at all? The sources rarely let us know, so we should resist turning him into either a monster or a hero. Both are too simple. The Fidai was a human being shaped by a demanding structure of belief and discipline. He was also an instrument of targeted violence. He may have been honored by his own community and hated by the families of those he killed. He may have acted with calm resolve while causing panic in everyone around him. The moral reality is not neat, which is exactly why the legend tried to make it neat. Legends prefer clear categories. History, inconveniently, often gives us people. The Fidai also changed the emotional balance between the Hashashin and their enemies. In normal warfare, numbers matter because one side can overwhelm another through force. But when even a single agent is willing to die to reach a target, the arithmetic changes. A ruler must defend against not only survival instincts, but the absence of them. Guards can frighten a man who hopes to escape. They are less effective against someone who has already accepted that the mission may end with his own death. This does not make him unstoppable. It makes him difficult to deter. That difference was crucial. Many systems of security assume that danger can be discouraged by punishment. Capture the attacker, execute him, display the body, and others will think twice. But the Fidai's role weakened that logic. If death was already part of the mission, then punishment came too late to prevent the message. The attacker's death might even confirm the reputation of the movement. These were people willing to pay the price. That was why the Fida'i became so central to the fear surrounding Alamut. He embodied the most disturbing promise of the order. Not that they had endless armies, but that they had individuals whose obedience could pierce the confidence of men guarded by armies. He was the narrow point where doctrine, organization, and psychological warfare met. Still, behind the dramatic moment, there must have been years of formation. Not fantasy training in secret gardens, but the slower shaping of loyalty. Teaching, ritual, hierarchy, example, shared danger, and the constant knowledge that the community existed under threat. A man does not become capable of such a mission in a single night. He is formed by a world that tells him what matters more than fear. That is the unsettling heart of the Fida'i. He reminds us that the strongest walls are not always made of stone, and the most dangerous weapons are not always forged by metalworkers. Sometimes the decisive weapon is a human will made narrow, sharpened by belief, and pointed toward one carefully chosen life. The Hashashin's enemies saw such men walking toward death and explained them with nightmares. The truth was likely less supernatural and far more difficult to dismiss. At some point, the Hashashin stopped being only a historical movement and became a mirror for other people's fears. That is where the gardens appear. According to famous later stories, young initiates were drugged, carried into a hidden paradise, surrounded by pleasure, beauty, and carefully staged wonder, then brought back and told that obedience could return them to such bliss after death. In this version, Hassan-i Sabbah, or the figure later remembered as the Old Man of the Mountain, becomes less a political leader than a master illusionist, manufacturing devotion through deception. It is a powerful story. It is also one we should handle with great caution. The problem is not that medieval history lacks deception, harsh discipline, or religious manipulation. It has plenty of all three. The problem is that the most vivid tales about the assassins often come from outsiders, enemies, and later writers who had reasons to make the Nizari Ismailis appear exotic, irrational, and terrifying. The more spectacular the account, the more carefully we should ask what work the story is doing. The Paradise legend solves a problem for the frightened observer. It explains loyalty without respecting it. If a Fida'i was willing to die, the observer did not have to consider the possibility of deep conviction, communal identity, political desperation, or disciplined religious obedience. He could say, the man was drugged, the man was tricked, the man believed he had already seen heaven and merely wanted to return. In one stroke, the Fida'i becomes less human, less intellectually serious, and less politically troubling. That kind of explanation is comforting to power. It is much easier for rulers and chroniclers to imagine that their enemies are bewitched than to admit that a persecuted minority may have built a coherent structure of belief strong enough to command sacrifice. The Paradise myth turns history into a stage trick. It reduces organization to sorcery, theology to intoxication, and strategy to sinister theater. But myths rarely survive by being useless. The legend of the secret garden endured because it expressed something people genuinely sensed about the Hashashin. Their power depended on a kind of obedience that outsiders found hard to understand. The details may be unreliable, but the anxiety beneath them was real. How does a leader persuade men to die? How does a small fortress community create loyalty stronger than fear? How does an invisible network make kings doubt their guards? The myth answers badly, but it asks revealing questions. The title, Old Man of the Mountain, belongs to this same world of distortion and fascination. It became attached in Western and Crusader imagination to the remote master commanding assassins from a mountain stronghold. It is a phrase with almost too much atmosphere built into it, which is probably why it survived. You can hear the legend forming inside the words: age, secrecy, height, authority, distance from ordinary law. But the phrase also blurs reality. Hassan-i Sabbah was not merely an eerie elder issuing death sentences from a fortress, like a character in a traveler's nightmare. He was a religious organizer, political strategist, and leader of a besieged community. Later Nizari leaders and Syrian branches of the movement also contributed to the broader reputation that Crusaders encountered. Over time, different places, leaders, and stories were compressed into one shadowy figure because legends prefer a single face. History is messier. The Nizari Ismailis were not one man's magic trick. They were a community with doctrine, hierarchy, fortresses, diplomacy, internal discipline, and long-term political aims. Their enemies often described them through accusation because accusation was useful. To call them heretics, fanatics, deceivers, or drugged murderers was not only moral judgment, it was political language. It told listeners that these people did not need to be understood, only feared and destroyed. And yet, we should not swing too far in the other direction. Correcting propaganda does not mean polishing the assassins into innocent victims. Their targeted killings were real. Their intimidation was deliberate. Their reputation was not built from nothing. The dagger, the public strike, the willingness of agents to die. These gave hostile imagination material to work with. Myths grow fastest when they attach themselves to something people already fear. The Hashashin gave the medieval world enough real fear that fantasy could grow around it. This is why the Paradise legend is so revealing. It is probably not reliable as a literal description of initiation, but as evidence of reputation, it is valuable. It shows how the Order's enemies explained a form of commitment they could not easily defeat. It shows how secrecy invites invention. It shows how a remote mountain fortress becomes, in the minds of outsiders, not merely a military site, but a hidden world where ordinary rules no longer apply. Secrecy creates empty space. Storytelling rushes in to fill it. That is a pattern far larger than Alamut. Human beings dislike blank areas on the map, especially when danger seems to come from them. A closed community becomes a cult. A disciplined agent becomes a mindless slave. A mountain stronghold becomes a palace of illusions. A leader becomes an ancient puppet master. Each exaggeration makes the unknown feel more understandable, even if the understanding is false. The irony is that the myth of paradise may have made the Hashashin seem less sophisticated than they were. Drugged obedience is a crude explanation. It imagines men controlled from the outside. The real Nizari achievement, if we can call it that, was subtler and more durable. They built systems of loyalty, meaning, and fear that could survive across decades. A drug wears off. A theatrical garden can be exposed. But a community that believes it is preserving truth under siege can endure long after the first witnesses die. That is harder to dramatize, but far more historically powerful. The Paradise myth also tells us something about the Crusader imagination. To Western observers encountering the politics of Syria, Persia, and the wider Islamic world, the assassins appeared both alien and strangely comprehensible. Crusaders knew religious warfare. They knew vows, orders, sacrifice, martyrdom, and obedience. But the Hashashin's secrecy and targeted violence unsettled them because it did not resemble the open military ideals they preferred to celebrate. So the story became stranger in translation. What could not be comfortably categorized became marvelous. And marvelous stories travel well. By the time later audiences inherited the image of the assassin, much of the historical Nizari world had been buried beneath layers of retelling. The word itself became detached from its context. The Fidai became the ancestor of every fictional secret killer. Alamut became a fantasy citadel. Hassan became the old man with forbidden knowledge. The actual community, with its theology, politics, vulnerabilities, and survival strategies, receded into the background. That is what legends often do. They preserve a name while replacing the person. So when we hear of hidden gardens and drugged initiates, the best response is neither simple belief nor smug dismissal. The better question is, why did people need this story to be true? What fear did it organize? What political purpose did it serve? What real behavior did it exaggerate until it became almost unrecognizable? The answer brings us closer to the human center of the history. The Hashashin frightened their enemies because they were disciplined, secretive, and willing to use symbolic violence with precision. Their enemies then made them even more frightening by imagining impossible methods behind that discipline. In the end, the myth and the reality fed each other. Real acts created fear. Fear created stories. Stories increased the reputation. Reputation became another form of power. A garden may never have been needed. The mountain was enough. And from that mountain, the legend of the old man would travel far beyond the world that first produced it, into crusader camps, European chronicles, and eventually the long afterlife of the assassin as one of history's most misunderstood names. The Templars were not easily frightened men. They were built for visibility. White mantles, red crosses, castles on contested frontiers, armed discipline wrapped in religious vows. In the Crusader states, the Knights Templar represented one of the most recognizable forms of power the Latin East could produce. Militant, wealthy, organized, and unashamedly public, they were an army with a theology. The Hashashin were something else. Where the Templars projected force outward, the Nizari Ismailis learned to project uncertainty inward. The contrast is almost too perfect. One order made power visible through armor, fortresses, cavalry, and banners. The other made power invisible through networks, secrecy, selective violence, and the carefully cultivated fear that someone near you might already have crossed the line between servant and enemy. Both were disciplined. Both were religious. Both existed in a world where faith and war could not be cleanly separated, but they frightened people in different languages. The Templars spoke the language of the battlefield. Their presence could be seen from a distance. They guarded roads, held castles, escorted pilgrims, and entered combat as a recognizable military body. Even their mystery, and later there would be plenty attached to them, was built on a foundation of public authority. Their houses, lands, privileges, and military role were known. The Hashashin operated through ambiguity. This does not mean they had no fortresses, no commanders, or no public existence. They did. But their most famous strength came from the parts of power that could not be easily counted. Who was loyal? Who was only pretending? Which messenger carried doctrine, and which carried intelligence? Was a diplomatic gesture sincere, strategic, or both? Was silence a sign of weakness or preparation? For Crusader lords, and especially for military orders like the Templars, this created a difficult kind of respect. The Templars understood discipline. They understood vows. They understood that men could be trained to risk death for a sacred cause. That may be one reason the assassins were not merely dismissed as ordinary criminals in Crusader imagination. They were feared, yes, and often demonized, but they were also recognized as something organized and formidable. A loose gang of murderers does not become a lasting political factor. A disciplined order does. This is where the Shadow War comes into focus. The Crusader states were not simple islands of Christian power, surrounded by one unified Muslim enemy. The region was fragmented, negotiated, improvised, and constantly shifting. Crusader rulers fought Muslim rulers, allied with some against others, paid tribute, accepted truces, broke them, and tried to survive in a landscape where ideology and necessity rarely matched perfectly. The Nizari Ismailis belonged to that same complicated world. They were not always enemies of the Crusaders. That fact may surprise people raised on simplified crusade maps, where every group fits neatly into a colored block. In reality, the assassins could negotiate, threaten, cooperate temporarily, or hold back depending on circumstance. Their relationships with Crusader powers, including the Templars, were shaped by survival as much as doctrine. A small community surrounded by larger enemies cannot afford the luxury of hating everyone equally at all times. The Templars, for their part, had reason to take them seriously. A castle can resist cavalry. A knight can meet another armed man in battle. A garrison can prepare for siege. But how does a military order defend against influence that moves through servants, envoys, converts, local informants, and political rumor? The Templars were experts in fortified space. The Hashashin specialized in the insecurity of human space. That difference did not make one superior in every situation. It made them dangerous to each other in different ways. If the Templars wanted to project control, they needed routes, agreements, strongholds, and reliable local knowledge. The assassins could disturb that control by making trust expensive. A frontier castle was not only walls and knights. It depended on interpreters, traders, peasants, guides, craftsmen, and messengers. Every frontier power lived through intermediaries, and intermediaries are exactly where hidden influence can gather. The Shadow War, then, was not a constant exchange of blades in moonlit corridors. That image belongs more to fiction than history. It was a contest over access, leverage, and fear. Sometimes the threat was direct violence. Sometimes it was diplomacy backed by the possibility of violence. Sometimes it was the simple knowledge that the other side could not be ignored. This is one of the most useful ways to understand the relationship between the Templars and the Hashashin. Not as opposites from a legend, but as rival answers to the same medieval problem. How does a minority force survive in dangerous territory? The Templars answered with institutional wealth, papal privileges, fortified houses, military professionalism, and public religious identity. The Hashashin answered with mountain strongholds, missionary networks, selective intimidation, and a reputation so sharp it could cut before any blade appeared. Both strategies were products of pressure. Both depended on discipline. Both attracted myth because outsiders sensed that ordinary explanations were not enough. There is also an irony here. The Templars, in later European memory, would themselves become victims of legend, accused of secret rituals, hidden corruption, and sinister powers. They were eventually transformed in imagination into something far stranger than the historical order. In that sense, they and the assassins share a strange afterlife. Each was a disciplined medieval religious organization. Each became the subject of stories that exaggerated secrecy until it swallowed reality. But during the period we are watching, the Templars were not symbols in a conspiracy tale. They were active players in a hard political world. They could negotiate when needed and fight when required. They knew that survival in the Levant depended not only on courage, but on information. And information was precisely the terrain on which the Hashashin were most unsettling. A Templar fortress could dominate a road. An assassin rumor could enter the mind of the man responsible for that road. That is the difference. Visible power can impose itself on geography. Invisible power imposes itself on judgment. Once a lord or commander believes he may be watched, targeted, or quietly approached through channels he does not control, every decision acquires a second shadow. Do I attack? Do I bargain? Do I delay? Do I trust this messenger? Is this local ally sincere or merely useful to someone else? The Hashashin did not need to defeat the Templars in open war to matter to them. They needed only to become a factor in their calculations. And they did. This is why the old stories of crusaders and assassins endure, even when the details have to be sifted carefully. They bring together two forms of medieval discipline that seem, at first glance, almost opposite: the knight in the open sun and the agent in the crowd. One relies on the weight of armor, the other on the weightlessness of doubt. Yet both understood something modern retellings sometimes forget. Fear is not the opposite of faith. In the medieval world, the two often marched side by side. A man could believe deeply and still be afraid. He could wear a cross or serve an imam and still glance at the stranger standing too close. He could command a fortress and still wonder whether the real breach had already happened somewhere behind him. The Templars built walls against armies. The Hashashin made men question the walls inside their own lives. The assassins were not at war with everyone all the time. That may sound obvious, but it is one of the first things legend tends to erase. In the popular imagination, the Hashashin often appear as pure enemies of the world, hidden killers in mountain castles, permanently hostile, permanently plotting, untouched by ordinary politics. It is a dramatic picture. It is also too simple to be useful. A movement that survives for generations, while surrounded by stronger powers, cannot live by hostility alone. It must bargain. It must wait. It must sometimes speak politely to men it distrusts, pay what it resents, accept temporary arrangements, and choose the least dangerous enemy before the most dangerous one arrives. That is not hypocrisy. It is politics under pressure. The Nizari Ismailis were not only a religious community and not only a network of feared agents. They were also political actors trying to keep people alive in a world where moral purity could become a fast road to extinction. This is where their story becomes more mature and in some ways more interesting. Assassination is memorable because it is abrupt. Diplomacy is harder to dramatize because its victories are often invisible. A letter not burned. A tribute payment accepted. A truce extended, a hostile ruler distracted, a fortress left alone for one more season. But for a besieged mountain state, these quiet outcomes could matter as much as the death of a famous enemy. Survival was not made only from bold acts. It was made from compromises that no later legend wanted to celebrate. The Nizari Ismailis existed in a region where alliances could shift with uncomfortable speed. Seljuk authority, local dynasties, rival Muslim factions, crusader powers, and ambitious commanders all competed in overlapping ways. No single map could fully explain the situation, because loyalties did not always follow geography. A city might be officially under one authority while divided by internal sympathies. A local lord might condemn the Nizaris publicly while finding them useful privately. A crusader power might be an enemy in principle and a temporary counterweight in practice. This was not a world of clean lines. It was a world of calculations, and the assassins calculated carefully. They sometimes negotiated because negotiation bought time. They sometimes paid tribute because tribute could be cheaper than siege. They sometimes formed temporary understandings because a small power cannot afford to confuse pride with strategy. Their reputation for violence made such diplomacy stronger, not weaker. A deal with Alamut was never merely a deal with a weak neighbor. It was a deal with a community known for patience, reach, and retaliation. That reputation gave them leverage, but it also created danger. Once a group becomes feared for targeted killing, every negotiation is shadowed by suspicion. Was the envoy sincere? Was the gift a gesture of peace or a test of access? Was a promise binding, or only a pause before another act of pressure? The Nizaris had to work inside the fear they had helped create. Fear could protect them, but it could also make normal trust nearly impossible. This is the paradox of using terror as a political tool. It may force enemies to listen, but it also teaches them to doubt every word. For larger powers, diplomacy with the Nizaris required swallowing a certain discomfort. To negotiate with a movement condemned as heretical or treacherous could look shameful. Yet rulers often care more about danger than consistency. A sultan, emir, or crusader lord might denounce the assassins in one context and tolerate them in another if doing so served immediate needs. Medieval politics was full of such contradictions. Public language could be absolute, while private arrangements remained flexible. That does not mean everyone was secretly cynical. Belief mattered. Honor mattered. Religious identity mattered. But fear and necessity mattered too. Human beings are very capable of holding principles in one hand and emergency measures in the other. The frontier world of the Crusades and the fractured politics of the Islamic East demanded exactly that kind of uncomfortable balance. The Hashashin survived because they understood it. They knew when visibility was dangerous and when invisibility was not enough. They knew that a fortress can resist force, but only diplomacy can sometimes prevent the force from arriving. They knew that killing a hostile official might solve one problem while creating 3 more. They knew that restraint could be as deliberate as violence. An enemy left alive after a warning might become more useful than an enemy turned into a martyr. This is a crucial point. Their most effective actions were not always the bloodiest ones. A threat believed can achieve what an attack would risk. A ruler who changes policy because he fears becoming a target has already been influenced. A negotiated payment, a temporary peace, or a local arrangement might preserve Nizari lives without drawing the kind of retaliation that follows spectacular violence. The dagger was one instrument in a larger diplomatic language. Sometimes the language said, "Leave us alone." Sometimes it said, "We can be useful." Sometimes it said, "The cost of attacking us will be personal." And sometimes, perhaps, it said nothing at all, allowing silence to do the work. A feared movement does not need to announce every intention. Its enemies often provide the interpretation themselves. This is why we should think of Alamut not as a nest of constant murder, but as a political center making hard choices. Inside those walls, leaders had to judge which threats were existential and which could be delayed. They had to decide when doctrine required defiance and when survival required negotiation. They had to manage followers who expected courage, enemies who expected treachery, and neighbors who expected payment or protection. That is a difficult statecraft. Not noble in a simple sense, not villainous in a simple sense. Difficult. And difficulty is usually where real history lives. The more we look at the Nizaris as political actors, the more the myth of mindless fanaticism falls apart. Fanatics do not usually practice long-term diplomacy well. They do not easily build networks across hostile territory, maintain fortresses, negotiate with enemies, and survive decades of pressure. Whatever else they were, the leaders of Alamut were patient readers of circumstance. They had to be. A small community surrounded by larger powers has two choices: learn complexity or disappear. The Nizari Ismailis learned complexity so thoroughly that their enemies often mistook it for dark magic. A sudden killing seemed impossible unless explained by fanatic obedience. A temporary alliance seemed suspicious unless explained by treachery. A survival strategy seemed unnatural because it did not match the simple categories outsiders preferred. But the pattern is clear enough. They were not merely hiding from history. They were participating in it, using the limited tools available to them with unusual discipline. In the end, their diplomacy may tell us as much about them as their assassinations. Violence reveals what a movement is willing to do under pressure. Diplomacy reveals what it hopes to preserve. For Alamut, what had to be preserved was not only leadership or territory, but continuity. The survival of a community, a doctrine, a network of belonging, and a fragile political space carved out among enemies. That required daggers, yes, but also letters, payments, promises, awkward truces, and conversations with men who, under different circumstances, might have gladly burned the mountain clean. The Hashashin became infamous for making powerful men afraid to die. But their quieter achievement was learning how to make those same men hesitate before choosing war. Some names survive because they built cities, some because they ruled them, and some because their deaths became warnings. The history of the Hashashin is marked by names that appear suddenly, violently, and then echo far beyond the moment itself. These assassinations and attempted assassinations were not all identical. They did not all have the same cause, the same certainty of attribution, or the same political effect. Some are better documented than others. Some come to us through sources shaped by hostility, rumor, or the natural desire to make a death explain more than it truly can. But taken together, they show how Alamut projected power far beyond its size. The most important thing is not to recite a list of victims as though each death were a trophy on a wall. That would repeat the logic of legend rather than examine it. The real question is what these targets reveal. Why this man? Why this office? Why this moment? Why use a method that guaranteed attention, outrage, and fear? The answer usually lies in the structure of power. A medieval state did not depend only on the ruler at the top. It depended on the men who made rule function: viziers, governors, commanders, judges, preachers, envoys, and local authorities who turned policy into pressure. Remove one of them, and the state did not necessarily collapse, but a message passed through the wound. The people who remained were reminded that service against the Nizaris could become personal. One of the most famous early examples attached to the order is the killing of Nizam al-Mulk, the great Seljuk vizier, in 1092. His death became deeply associated with the rise of the assassins in later memory. We should be careful, as historians are, about the layers of political storytelling around such events. A figure as powerful as Nizam al-Mulk had many enemies, and the sources do not always give us the kind of clean certainty modern readers prefer. Yet the association itself matters. Whether viewed as a direct Nizari act or through the fog of contested accounts, the killing came to symbolize the vulnerability of Seljuk authority. Nizam al-Mulk was not merely an official. He was one of the great administrators of his age, a man whose power rested in the machinery of governance, patronage, religious policy, and imperial order. To imagine such a man reached by an assassin was to imagine the empire's nervous system exposed. That is why the story endured. It was not only a murder, it was a political metaphor. Other killings and attempted killings linked to the assassins followed the same larger pattern. The target was often someone whose position mattered beyond his body. A hostile commander could threaten fortresses. A governor could persecute communities. A religious authority could legitimize repression. A crusader lord could alter the balance of regional power. In each case, the act was not simply revenge. It was an intervention in decision-making, and sometimes, the attempted assassination mattered almost as much as success. A failed attack could still prove reach. It could still create fear. It could still force guards to tighten, routes to change, audiences to shrink, and rulers to wonder how close the danger had come before being stopped. Failure in ordinary warfare may end a campaign. Failure in psychological warfare can still leave a mark if it demonstrates intent and access. This was one of the unsettling features of Nizari strategy. A dead enemy was useful. A frightened enemy could be useful too. Consider the Crusader world, where the assassin's reputation became entangled with some of the most prominent figures of the Latin East. Stories of attempted attacks against major Crusader leaders and killings of important regional figures helped spread the idea that the order could move across religious and political boundaries with unnerving flexibility. Again, the evidence varies by case, and later retellings often sharpen uncertainty into legend. But the effect is unmistakable. Crusader elites learned to treat the assassins as a force that could not be dismissed merely because it lacked a conventional army. Their victims were chosen for visibility. That visibility was essential. If a little-known man died in a remote place, the political echo might be small. But if a prominent official was struck near a public setting, or a commander associated with a major policy was attacked, the meaning grew. The death became a sentence others could read. It said, "This role carries risk. This policy has consequences. This hostility may follow you past the battlefield. There is a grim efficiency in that." The Nizaris could not eliminate every enemy. They did not need to. They needed to make examples selective enough to be memorable and rare enough to remain frightening. Too many killings would blur together. Too few, and reputation would fade. Their power lay in the terrible discipline of choosing moments that made one death speak for many possible deaths. This is also why their enemies wrote about them with such intensity. A ruler killed in battle may be mourned as brave. A ruler killed by treachery, as his supporters would frame it, demands a different kind of explanation. Chroniclers searched for moral meaning. They described fanaticism, deception, hidden commands, unnatural obedience. They made the assassin into an emblem of disorder because the method itself threatened the official story of power. The great were supposed to fall to the great. Rival kings, armies, divine judgment, perhaps illness. To fall to an unknown man at close range was almost an insult to hierarchy. The Hashashin specialized in that insult, but we should not let the drama erase the limits. Their assassinations did not make them omnipotent. They did not bring down every enemy. They did not prevent sieges, campaigns, losses, or political reversals. Targeted killing can disrupt power, but it cannot replace all the functions of power. A movement still needs food, allies, fortresses, legitimacy, and succession. The dagger could open space. It could not build a world by itself. That is why Alamut remained so important. The names written in blood were extensions of a state under siege, not substitutes for it. Each act carried meaning because there was a community behind it, a leadership making decisions, and enemies who understood that the violence belonged to a larger struggle. Without that context, the assassinations become disconnected crimes. With it, they become a harsh form of political communication. And communication always depends on interpretation. Did every enemy read the message the way Alamut intended? Probably not. Did every killing produce the desired outcome? Almost certainly not. Did some acts inspire retaliation or deepen hatred? Yes. The use of fear is never fully controllable. Once released, it moves through rumor, grief, propaganda, and anger. The assassins could shape the first act. They could not govern every echo. Still, the cumulative effect was extraordinary for a community of their size. They became a factor in the minds of men who commanded far greater resources. That, more than any single assassination, was their achievement. They forced rulers to include Alamut in their calculations. They made officials weigh personal risk against policy. They turned the bodies of selected enemies into messages addressed to the living. This is why the list of names should not be read as a ledger of death. It should be read as a map of pressure. Each target reveals a point where the Nizari's believed force could be multiplied through fear. Each attempt shows how a mountain order reached into the wider political world. Each story, even when distorted, tells us what kind of threat their enemies believed they faced. A small state cannot always move borders, but it can move decisions. And sometimes, in this politics of survival, moving a decision is enough to keep the mountain alive for one more year. There is a kind of siege that does not begin outside the walls. No tents appear on the horizon. No drums move through the valley. No ladders are carried toward the battlements. The kitchens still prepare food. The guards still change shifts. The ruler still receives letters, hears petitions, attends prayer, and speaks in the language of command. But something has changed. Everyone knows it, even if no one says it clearly. The danger may already be inside. This was the deepest atmosphere created by the Hashashin. Not constant attack, but constant possibility. Their enemies did not live every moment under a raised dagger. That would be too simple and probably untrue. Courts continued to function. Campaigns were planned. Orders were signed. Men laughed, feasted, argued, schemed, and slept. Medieval politics did not freeze because Alamut existed, but fear entered the routine. That is more subtle and more corrosive. A ruler threatened by an army can point to the threat. He can summon troops, inspect defenses, send scouts, negotiate with allies. The enemy has a location. The danger occupies space. But the fear of infiltration behaves differently. It attaches itself to familiar things. A cup, a folded letter, a new servant, a man who has served too long and is suddenly too quiet, a religious gathering where bodies press close, a public procession that was once meant to display confidence, now redesigned around suspicion. The court becomes a place of second meanings. Every palace depends on invisible trust, not the romantic kind, the practical kind. Someone must prepare the ruler's meals. Someone must stand near his bedchamber. Someone must carry confidential messages. Someone must introduce visitors. Someone must decide which faces are ordinary enough to ignore. The higher a man rises, the more people are required to maintain the illusion that he is secure. The Hashashin attacked that illusion. Their reputation made proximity feel dangerous. Not all proximity, of course. A ruler could not dismiss everyone. He could not live without servants, guards, scribes, physicians, envoys, clerics, relatives, and companions. Power is crowded. That was precisely the problem. To govern, a man had to remain accessible enough for authority to operate, yet distant enough to survive. The assassins made that balance feel unstable. Imagine a ruler entering a mosque. The act is public, religious, and political all at once. He is seen by supporters. He confirms his place within a moral order. He performs piety before God and legitimacy before men. Yet the same space that gives him authority also exposes him. People stand near. Movements are constrained. Reverence may disguise intent. A man lowering his head in devotion may be praying, watching, or waiting. The fear does not require certainty. It requires the inability to rule possibility out. That is what made the siege psychological. Suspicion is expensive because it consumes attention. A ruler who suspects everyone becomes isolated from the very information he needs. A ruler who trusts too easily may invite disaster. Between paranoia and carelessness lies a narrow path, and the Hashashin's reputation narrowed it further. Guards suffered under this pressure too. A failed attack could destroy not only the target, but the careers and lives of those charged with protecting him. Every unfamiliar movement became a test. Every permitted visitor became a risk. Security is often remembered as a simple matter of more men, more weapons, more locked doors. But too much security can become its own weakness. It slows communication. It insults allies. It makes public authority look frightened. It turns a ruler into a prisoner of his own precautions. The Hashashin understood, at least in practice, that protection has political costs. A lord who refuses to appear in public may live longer, but he appears weaker. A minister who restricts access may become less informed. A commander who changes routes constantly may confuse his own household as much as his enemies. Fear does not merely defend, It distorts. And distortion, for a small mountain order facing larger powers, could be a form of success. This was not a siege that destroyed walls. It damaged judgment. Letters became especially delicate objects in such a world. A letter could carry orders, promises, threats, intelligence, or betrayal. It could be intercepted, forged, delayed, or delivered by the wrong hand. The messenger mattered almost as much as the message. Who sent him? Who vouched for him? Where had he stopped along the way? What did he see while waiting outside the chamber? In a politics of suspicion, communication itself becomes vulnerable. The same was true of servants and courtiers. Later legends often imagine the assassin as a shadowy stranger, but the more frightening possibility was the familiar face. Someone who had already become part of the household rhythm. Someone not noticed because he had been noticed too many times. That is how infiltration frightens power. It turns habit into a hiding place. And habit is everywhere. A ruler's daily route through a palace, the hour he receives petitioners, the person who brings his horse, the place where he removes armor, the moment after prayer, the small relaxation after ceremony. These are not grand historical events, so chronicles rarely linger over them. But they are where lives become reachable. The Hashashin's reputation grew from the understanding that power, for all its ceremony, still depends on repeated human patterns. No man can be vigilant in every repeated moment. No court can inspect every loyalty without destroying itself. That is why fear of the assassins could spread even where no assassin stood. Once the idea was present, the mind supplied the rest. A ruler did not need proof that an agent had entered his household to wonder whether one had. An official did not need a direct threat to imagine his name being discussed in Alamut. A guard did not need evidence of betrayal to distrust the colleague standing beside him. The siege of fear was partly self-sustaining. This does not mean the Nizaris controlled every nervous thought of their enemies. They were not supernatural strategists, and we should not grant them the omnipotence that legend later suggested. But they benefited from a political environment already full of rivalry, betrayal, sectarian hostility, and court intrigue. Suspicion was not invented by Alamut. The Hashashin sharpened what was already there. That is an important distinction. They did not create the fragility of power. They exposed it. Medieval rulers liked to appear as centers of order. Their robes, titles, guards, ceremonies, and architecture all insisted that hierarchy was solid. But behind the performance was a dependence on ordinary people doing ordinary tasks correctly and loyally. The assassins made that dependence visible in the worst possible way. They reminded the powerful that authority rests on human access, and human access can be compromised. For those living under that possibility, life could become quietly claustrophobic, not always dramatic, not always panicked, just narrowed. A doorway watched more carefully, a conversation cut shorter, a servant replaced, a journey postponed, a public appearance surrounded by tension, a private meal taken with less appetite. These small changes are difficult to measure, but they are part of political history. Fear often works through adjustments too minor for a chronicler to notice and too important for a ruler to ignore. The Hashashin's greatest victories may not all have been deaths. Some may have been hesitations, a punishment not ordered, a campaign delayed, a negotiation reopened. A hostile official made cautious because caution felt wiser than pride. We cannot trace every such moment, and it would be dishonest to pretend we can. But the logic of their reputation points there. The possibility of violence influenced behavior even when violence did not occur. That is what made the siege so effective. An army outside the walls must be fed. Fear inside the walls feeds itself. And as long as rulers believed that Alamut could place uncertainty near their bodies, the mountain fortress was present even in rooms its agents never entered. It stood invisibly in the corner of courts, in the pause before a letter was opened, in the glance toward a servant who lingered too long. The Hashashin did not need to own the palace. They only needed the palace to doubt itself. For generations, Alamut had survived by understanding the limits of its enemies. That was the hidden confidence behind the mountain. Seljuk power could be dangerous, but it was political power, and political power has joints. Local rulers could threaten, but they could also be distracted, bribed, frightened, replaced, or drawn into rivalries. Crusader lords could fight, negotiate, and retreat. Regional enemies could be studied. Their habits could be entered. Their ambitions could be played against one another. The Nizari Ismailis had learned to survive in that world. Then the Mongols arrived, and the rules began to change. The Mongol conquests did not behave like another local rivalry added to an already crowded map. They brought a scale and momentum that made older strategies feel suddenly fragile. A fortress state designed to outlast neighboring powers now faced an imperial machine that could move across enormous distances, absorb expertise, punish resistance, and treat destruction not as a last resort, but as a method of rule. Against such force, secrecy was still useful, but it was no longer enough. This is one of the great turning points in the story, because the Hashashin's strengths were not imaginary. They had endured for a reason. Their castles were difficult to reach. Their agents were disciplined. Their reputation mattered. Their diplomacy could buy time. Their targeted killings could make individuals hesitate. But all strategies are fitted to a particular environment. A method that works against one kind of enemy may fail against another. The Mongols were not immune to fear, but they were less vulnerable to the specific fear Alamut had perfected. A regional ruler might be deterred by the possibility of assassination because his personal survival was bound tightly to the stability of his court. Remove him or frighten him, and policy might shift. A vizier or commander might reconsider persecution if he believed danger could follow him into private life. But the Mongol imperial structure, especially as it expanded westward, was not easily turned aside by the threat posed to one official. It had depth. It had replacement capacity. It had a culture of campaign discipline and collective momentum that made personal intimidation less decisive. A dagger could disturb a court. It could not easily stop a continent in motion. That does not mean the Nizaris had no options. They still possessed fortresses. They still understood negotiation. They still had the memory of survival against stronger enemies. But the Mongol advance compressed time. The old advantage of waiting, watching, and wearing enemies down depended on enemies who had reasons to pause. The Mongols often made pause feel like a courtesy they were not inclined to grant. There is a chilling simplicity in that. For much of their history, the assassins had benefited from complexity. Fragmented politics gave them room to maneuver. Rival powers created gaps. Local grievances became opportunities. Diplomacy could turn one enemy against another. Even fear itself depended on a world full of personal relationships, courtly access, and reputational calculation. The Mongol campaigns reduced complexity by overwhelming it. Cities, fortresses, dynasties, and local arrangements that had once formed a tangled political web were forced into a more brutal question: submit, resist, or be destroyed. In such a landscape, subtlety did not disappear, but it lost some of its protective power. The hidden corridor mattered less when the entire building was marked for demolition. Alamut had been built for endurance, but endurance is not the same as invulnerability. This is where the emotional weight of the story begins to shift. Up to this point, the mountain fortress can almost seem like a mind outthinking larger bodies. It survives by patience, discipline, and the refusal to fight on terms chosen by its enemies. But the Mongol threat exposes the limit of all asymmetric power. A smaller force can disturb a larger one. It can delay, frighten, confuse, and sometimes redirect it. Yet if the larger force is willing to spend enough lives, time, and destruction, the smaller force eventually confronts the question every fortress fears: what happens when the enemy does not need to be clever? The Mongols did not need to believe every legend about the assassins. They needed only to identify their strongholds and reduce their ability to function as a political network. The very things that had preserved the Nizaris, their castles, their mountain bases, their known centers of authority, could become targets once a determined imperial campaign focused on them. A hidden network is hardest to crush when it remains diffuse. A fortress state, however remote, still occupies the map. Alamut's height could slow an enemy. It could not remove itself from geography. And geography, for the Mongols, was something to be crossed. The approach of Mongol power must have felt different from earlier threats. A Seljuk campaign might be feared, but it belonged to a familiar political universe. The Mongols carried stories ahead of them, of cities taken, populations shattered, rulers humbled, and resistance answered with overwhelming force. Their reputation, too, was a weapon. In a grim reversal, the Hashashin now faced an empire that understood psychological warfare on a scale far beyond the assassination of individuals. Fear met fear, but not as equals. The Nizari system had been designed to make rulers imagine vulnerability. Mongol power made entire regions imagine erasure. One worked inward, toward the guarded body of a chosen target. The other moved outward, across landscapes, making examples of cities and fortresses. Both understood the politics of terror, but the scale was radically different. That difference mattered. The assassins could make a lord hesitate before entering a courtyard. The Mongols could make a city debate whether survival required surrender before the army arrived. The assassins used precision. The Mongols used mass and momentum. Precision is elegant, but mass can be merciless. By the mid-13th century, the world that had allowed Alamut to endure was narrowing. The old game of selective pressure and dangerous diplomacy became harder to play. Temporary arrangements could no longer guarantee safety. Reputation could no longer keep destruction at a distance. The fortress above the clouds was still formidable, still symbolic, still remembered with dread by enemies. But it now faced a power for which taking difficult places was not an exception to strategy. It was part of the work. This is not the moment to imagine panic in every room of Alamut. We do not need to invent scenes the sources cannot give us. But we can understand the strategic dread. The Nizari leadership had to recognize that the Mongols were not merely another enemy to be infiltrated, threatened, or outweighted. They represented a different political weather system. The mountain that had once turned armies away now stood beneath a storm that had crossed half the world. There is a tragic irony here. The Hashashin had become famous by proving that no ruler was entirely safe behind walls. Now they would face an enemy proving that no wall was entirely safe behind legend. For nearly 2 centuries, Alamut had been more than stone. It had been a center of memory, command, doctrine, fear, and survival. Its very existence told the surrounding world that a small, disciplined community could endure among empires. But the Mongol advance asked whether endurance could survive when empire itself became a moving catastrophe. The answer would come in 1256, not in the form of another myth, not in a secret garden, not in a dagger carried into a royal chamber, but in the exposure of the mountain world itself, the hidden heart brought under open pressure, the fortress no longer watching from above history, but trapped inside history's most unforgiving march. When Alamut surrendered in 1256, the end did not arrive as the legends might have preferred. There was no final scene of supernatural loyalty, no impossible defense that broke the mountains open, no secret army rising from hidden passages to swallow the invader. The fortress that had haunted rulers for generations came under the pressure of a Mongol campaign, and the world inside the myth was forced into the open. That exposure may have been the most painful part. For nearly 2 centuries, Alamut had been powerful, partly because it was difficult to see. It stood high, distant, and guarded by geography, discipline, and reputation. Enemies imagined what happened there because most of them could not enter and look. That distance protected the Nizari Ismailis physically, but it also protected the atmosphere around them. A hidden world can remain larger in the mind than it is in stone. The Mongols changed that. Under Hulegu's campaign, the Nizari strongholds faced a force that did not treat remoteness as mystery. It treated remoteness as a logistical problem. Mountain castles could be surrounded. Access routes could be studied. Local submissions could be demanded. Fortresses could be isolated one by one. The same landscape that had once multiplied Nizari strength now became a map of targets for an empire skilled at turning geography into sequence. This place, then that place, then the next. Alamut had survived because earlier enemies could be delayed, divided, frightened, or negotiated with. The Mongols were harder to make uncertain. By the time Alamut fell, the symbolic balance had reversed. For generations, rulers had wondered whether the danger from Alamut might already be inside their walls. Now Alamut itself had to confront the enemy outside its own. The fortress that had projected fear outward became the object of a larger fear moving inward. It is difficult to imagine a more complete inversion of the Order's old power. The surrender in 1256 marked the destruction of the fortress state, but it should not be mistaken for the disappearance of Nizari Ismaili history. This distinction matters. States can fall, libraries can burn, strongholds can be dismantled, leaders can surrender. But communities, beliefs, and memories do not always obey the same timetable as fortifications. The Mongols could break the mountain center, but they could not erase every person shaped by the tradition it had sheltered. Still, the loss was enormous. Alamut was more than a command post. It was a vessel of continuity. It held the weight of Hassan-i Sabbah's achievement, the discipline of generations. The memory of danger survived, and the political imagination of a community that had learned to live while surrounded. Its fall was not just military defeat. It was the collapse of a world that had been organized around height, concealment, endurance, and the belief that patience could outlast the violence below. A fortress can become a habit of thought. For the Nizaris, Alamut had taught a way of surviving. Hold the high places, trust the network, use fear carefully, wait longer than your enemies expect. When that center was broken, the method itself was wounded. Not because every Nizari vanished, but because the architecture of confidence had been shattered. The mountain no longer stood as proof that the community could resist indefinitely. There is also the question of what was lost in the destruction. Later accounts speak of the Mongols exposing and damaging the intellectual and material world of Alamut. We should be cautious about turning that into melodrama, because medieval descriptions of ruined libraries and hidden treasures often grow in the telling. But even cautious history can recognize the tragedy of archives broken under conquest. A community like the Nizaris preserved not only weapons and supplies, but records, doctrine, correspondence, and memory. When a fortress falls, the past housed inside it becomes vulnerable. Conquerors often destroy more than buildings. They interrupt the future's ability to understand. That may be one reason the assassins were so easily overtaken by legend afterward. When a community loses its centers of preservation, hostile stories gain room to dominate. Enemies explain what they destroyed. Outsiders repeat what they heard. Later audiences inherit the most colorful versions because the quieter records are missing, scattered, or written from positions of defeat. The fall of Alamut did not create the myth of the assassins, but it helped freeze it. Once the fortress was gone, it could become anything imagination required. A den of murderers, a secret paradise, a mountain throne of the old man, a warning about fanaticism, a thrilling setting for travelers and storytellers. The real place, with its storage rooms, anxious councils, harsh winters, practical routines, and human compromises, disappeared behind the cleaner shape of legend. That is often what happens when a hidden world is conquered. It is not simply revealed, it is simplified. For the Mongols, the fall was part of a larger imperial process. For the Nizaris, it was a rupture. For later memory, it became a scene of ending. The feared mountain finally opened, the secret order finally broken, the Dagger state finally brought under the weight of a greater violence. But endings in history rarely stay where chroniclers put them. The Nizari Ismaili community did not vanish from the world in 1256. Its political form changed. Its centers shifted. Its survival became less tied to Alamut as a physical place. That survival should caution us against treating the Mongol victory as total in every sense. The fortress fell. The tradition endured, altered, but not erased. There is something quietly important in that. The enemies of the Hashashin often imagined power in dramatic terms. The assassination, the fortress, the hidden master, the sudden death of a ruler. The Mongols answered with an even larger drama: conquest, surrender, destruction. But beneath both kinds of spectacle, the longer story of Nizari survival continued through less visible means. Families, teachings, loyalties, and religious memory outlived the stone. Alamut's fall then was both final and not final. Final for the fortress state that had shaped nearly 2 centuries of fear. Not final for the people whose history had become trapped beneath that fear. And perhaps that is the most honest way to stand before the ruins. Not as tourists of mystery, searching for secret chambers that prove the wildest stories. Not as judges eager to reduce a whole community to its most violent acts, but as witnesses to a place where strategy, belief, desperation, and imagination came together so forcefully that even its destruction could not end its influence. In 1256, The mountain was taken. The walls were broken. The hidden center was exposed. But the idea that Alamut had perfected, that power could be made afraid from within, had already escaped the fortress long before the Mongols arrived. After Alamut fell, the legend became easier to tell than the history. That is usually how memory behaves when a complex community is defeated. The victors keep the loudest explanations. Enemies preserve the most useful accusations. Outsiders repeat the strangest details because strange details travel well. Over time, the people themselves become smaller, while the stories about them grow taller. The assassins suffered exactly this fate. In later imagination, they became supernatural killers, drugged fanatics, or villains hiding in mountain castles, waiting only for a command to murder. The actual Nizari Ismailis were far more difficult to reduce. They were a religious political community under pressure, trying to survive among powers that were larger, richer, and often hostile to their very existence. Their methods could be ruthless. Their targeted killings were real, but they were not born from simple madness, and they cannot be explained honestly as mere bloodlust. They belonged to a world where survival itself had become political. To reassess them is not to excuse them. That distinction matters. It is possible to understand why a community used fear without pretending fear is harmless. It is possible to recognize persecution and vulnerability without turning every violent response into virtue. The Nizaris were neither innocent victims in a clean moral tale nor monsters from a crusader nightmare. They were human beings making dangerous choices inside a dangerous world. That is harder to narrate, which may be why legend preferred something simpler. A villainous cult is easy to condemn. A besieged community using assassination as statecraft is harder to think about. But the second version is closer to the real problem. The Hashashin force us to look at power from an uncomfortable angle. Most histories of empire describe the large movements first. Armies, rulers, dynasties, campaigns, treaties, and conquests. The Nizaris remind us that smaller powers also shape history, not by matching the size of empires, but by finding the points where empires are strangely fragile. A vast state may command thousands of soldiers, yet still depend on individual men who eat, sleep, travel, trust servants, and appear in public. The assassins built their strategy around that contradiction. Their enemies called them treacherous because they refused the battlefield preferred by stronger men. But weaker powers rarely get to choose honorable conditions. When open battle means destruction, the moral language of open battle can become a luxury owned by the already powerful. The Nizaris chose other methods because other methods were available to them. Some were diplomatic, some defensive, some intellectual, some violent. And the violent ones became the memory. That is one of the tragedies of the story. The dagger survived more vividly than the library. The assassination survived more vividly than the sermon. The terrifying agent survived more vividly than the ordinary believer, the messenger, the family, the scholar, the farmer near a mountain fortress, the frightened community member wondering whether the next campaign would end everything. Legend loves the exceptional figure because ordinary survival is too quiet for myth. But history is often made from quiet endurance. For nearly 2 centuries, the Nizari Ismailis maintained a presence in hostile territory. That required more than murder. It required organization, doctrine, leadership, local alliances, discipline, resource management, and a capacity to adapt. A movement cannot survive that long on shock alone. Shock fades. Fear must be maintained, but so must bread, water, communication, succession, and belief. This is what the legends tried to bury, the infrastructure beneath the terror. The myth of the assassin turns a complex society into a weapon with legs. It imagines obedience without thought, killing without context, secrecy without administration, and leadership without community. It is a dramatic myth, but it is also a lazy one. It denies the Nizaris the seriousness of their own history, even while exaggerating their danger. That denial served their enemies well. If the assassins were merely drugged murderers, then no one needed to ask why people joined them. If they were only fanatics, no one needed to examine the political order that made their survival so precarious. If Hassan-i Sabbah was only the old man of the mountain, then his actual skill as an organizer could be replaced by a Gothic caricature. Propaganda often works by making an enemy look both terrifying and intellectually beneath attention. The Nizaris were terrifying to many of their enemies. They were not beneath attention. Their story also warns us about the afterlife of names. The word assassin eventually traveled far from its medieval context, becoming a general term for a killer of important people. In that journey, the Nizari world was flattened into a function. A community became a concept. A history became a profession. The original struggles over belief, legitimacy, survival, and political pressure faded behind a word people now use without hearing the mountains inside it. That kind of forgetting is subtle. It does not erase the name, it empties it. So what remains when we strip away the secret gardens, the mind control, the easy villainy, and the heroic countermyths? We are left with a small but resilient movement that understood fear as a form of power. We are left with leaders who built fortresses and networks because the open field belonged to others. We are left with agents whose devotion unsettled enemies because it could not be explained away comfortably. We are left with a community whose violence became legendary, partly because its vulnerability was forgotten. This is the more honest picture, not pure, not simple, not supernatural. The Hashashin were a product of pressure, conviction, intelligence, and desperation. Their methods disturbed empires because they attacked the emotional center of authority, the belief that rank creates safety. Their enemies hated them not only because they killed, but because they made the powerful feel reachable. That is why the legend survived even after the fortress fell. The world has never lacked armies. It has never lacked rulers who believe their guards, walls, titles, and rituals can separate them from danger. The Hashashin remain unsettling because they represent the moment that separation fails. They are remembered as shadows, but the deeper lesson is not about shadows at all. It is about proximity. The thing history tried to bury was not simply a secret order of killers. It was the uncomfortable fact that power, however grand it appears, is always built out of human trust, and human trust can be entered, bent, bought, broken, or believed into something stronger than fear. In the end, the Hashashin did not survive in memory because their castles were unconquerable. They were not. Alamut fell. Its mountain world was exposed, broken, and folded into a larger history of conquest. The rulers who feared it died in their own time. The empires that surrounded it changed shape, fractured, vanished, or returned under other names. Even the stories told about the assassins became distorted, translated, embroidered, and used for purposes their original world would not have recognized. And still, the idea endured. That is the strange afterlife of Alamut. The fortress was destroyed, but the fear it represented proved more portable than stone. It traveled through chronicles, crusader tales, political memory, and eventually into the word assassin itself, a word now detached from the people whose history gave it force. The name became larger than the community, and in becoming larger, it became less accurate, but not meaningless. The Hashashin remained powerful in memory because they discovered, with unusual discipline, that the imagination of danger can be a political instrument. They showed that a small movement, if organized carefully, could unsettle men who possessed far greater armies. They could not defeat every enemy. They could not stop the Mongols. They could not make mountain walls eternal, but for a long time, they made power feel less safe than power wanted to feel. That was their true invention, not assassination itself. Political killing existed long before them, not secrecy itself. Every court had secrets, not devotion unto death. Many religious and military traditions have known sacrifice. Their particular genius was combination: fortress, faith, network, reputation, selected violence, and patience. Together, these created an army that did not need to march in order to arrive. It entered calculations. It entered rumors. It entered the private fear of a man who realized that the people nearest to him were also the people he could least afford to distrust. This is why their story still unsettles. The Hashashin ask a question that no ruler, ancient or modern, ever wants to answer. What is protection worth if danger can become familiar? A wall can stop an army. A guard can block a stranger, but a trusted face, a routine, a habit, a moment of public confidence, these are harder to defend without damaging the very life they are meant to protect. Their enemies tried to bury that lesson beneath myth. They spoke of secret gardens, drugged initiates, blind obedience, and an old man commanding death from a mountain. Those stories made the assassins sound less human and more monstrous. But the more careful truth is more disturbing. They were human. Their followers believed, planned, feared, obeyed, negotiated, and killed inside a world that often left them few safe choices and many dangerous ones. Understanding that does not cleanse the blood from the story. It simply prevents the blood from becoming the only story. The Hashashin were not supernatural shadows. They were not simple villains. They were not the invincible masters of every courtly nightmare. They were a besieged religious political community that learned to survive by making stronger powers hesitate. Their violence was selective, symbolic, and terrifying because it aimed beyond the victim toward the minds of the living. And that is why the memory lasted. Armies are remembered when they win battles. Empires are remembered when they build monuments. The Hashashin are remembered because they changed the emotional architecture of power. They made fortified men imagine invisible breaches. They made ceremony feel exposed. They made the private room feel political. Their castles fell. Their legends lied. Their enemies moved on. But the fear they perfected remained. Sometimes the most terrifying army is not the one marching across the plain, banners raised beneath the sun. It is the one that has no need to march at all, because it may already be inside the walls, waiting for power to believe, for one fatal moment, that it is safe.